It was the sort of morning that made even the most taciturn villagers remark on the weather. The sun filtered gently through wisps of white cloud, settling over the small village of St. Hilary Mead like a silken shawl. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with roses and damp earth, a fitting backdrop for the annual garden club gathering, hosted this year by the ever-gracious Mrs. Lavinia Hargreaves. Her home, the Laurels, was a handsome Georgian house on the edge of the green. The large bay windows were dressed in lace, and a riot of hydrangeas lined the path leading to the front door. By 2 o'clock, the women of St. Hilary Mead had begun to arrive in cheerful clusters, their voices fluttering through the garden like a chorus of finches. Miss Jane Marple, who had been persuaded by Mrs. Hargreaves to come out for a spot of sunshine and sensible company, took her place near the tea-table, knitting in hand. Her blue eyes, bright and deceptively mild, took in everything: the new hat Mrs. Pettigrew wore to show off her inheritance, the tension in the jaw of young Mrs. Beale, and the curious absence of Reverend Arkwright, who never missed a social occasion. "Such a pity about the vicar," Mrs. Hargreaves said, fanning herself as she poured tea. "He wrote to say he's feeling unwell, something about a touch of nerves, if you can imagine. Well, I dare say the church must be quite demanding these days." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, indeed. It can be very trying, can't it, dear? Particularly when one's conscience is involved." Mrs. Hargreaves blinked, uncertain what Miss Marple might mean, but before she could inquire, a shriek tore through the warm air. It came from the house. For a moment the party froze. Cups mid-air, laughter caught in throats. Then instinct prevailed, and the guests hurried toward the sound. At the front door, the housemaid, Alice, stood pale and trembling, one hand clutched at her apron. "Oh, ma'am, it's Mr. Hargreaves. He's... Mrs. Hargreaves pushed past her, rushing down the hall toward her husband's study. The guests followed, hesitant but curious, until they reached the frosted glass door at the end of the corridor. Behind it, the faint outline of a man's figure slumped unnaturally in his chair. "Fetch Dr. Wainwright," someone cried. But it was too late. The door was locked from the inside, and through the glass, the shadow of a motionless hand could be seen sprawled across the desk. Miss Marple stepped forward, eyes narrowing ever so slightly at the sight of the frost-edged glass. "Oh dear," she murmured softly, almost to herself. "That's most peculiar." At first no one moved, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Mrs. Hargreaves made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a word, pressed both palms to the cold pane, and recoiled as though the frost could burn. The maid, Alice, fluttered uselessly at the keyhole. Miss Marple's gaze slid from the clouded glass to the carpet runner, where the nap was slightly crushed by feet that had passed too often and too hurriedly. Then upward to the hall clock, whose brass pendulum swung on with untroubled regularity, indifferent to the little caving-in of a life. "Doctor first," Miss Marple said, no louder than if asking for another lump of sugar, and a boy from the kitchen, Bill, the odd-job lad who collected empty crates on Thursdays, shot off down the gravel path like a released spring. The rest drifted backward, glancing at one another with that guilty eagerness one only sees when something dreadful has occurred, and nobody is yet certain how near the dreadful thing may be to themselves. Inspector Ezra Cotterell of the County Constabulary arrived with Dr. Wainwright not long after Bill returned, panting and proud of having done a man's errand. The inspector was a florid man who wore his importance a little tight across the shoulders. The doctor, grey and spare, carried his bag as if it weighed more in days like this. Dr. Wainwright knelt at the door, peered through the frosted pane and straightened. "You'll have to force it. If he's merely fainted, the delay will do him no good." Inspector Cotterell nodded to the gardener, Tom Beale, a broad-backed fellow with soil ground into his cuticles, and between them they put a shoulder to the door. Something inside held for a second with a sort of rubbery resistance and then gave. The door swung in. Cold air slipped out, smelling faintly of old coal ash and lavender polish. Mr. Hargreaves sat behind his desk in a high-backed chair, head angled as if listening for a whisper that would not come. His eyes were fixed on the frosted pane the door had become when shut. One hand rested upon a sheet of paper, and the other drooped, palm up, over the arm of the chair. The doctor went to him at once, performed the respectful, futile rituals, and after a few moments looked at Mrs. Hargreaves with the softened face of a man who has said the same necessary words many times. She pressed her lace handkerchief to her mouth and nodded, a motion so small it could have been a tremor. Cotterell cleared his throat. "No one is to leave," he said, and as he said it, everyone remembered having intended exactly that. "I shall take names, and we will be orderly." He glanced at Miss Marple, because one always did in St. Hilary Mead, and then away again, deciding to be official. "Mrs. Hargreaves, I'll need to know when you last saw your husband." "This morning," she said, finding her voice. "He breakfasted at 8. He had letters. He went to his study at 9:30. I asked him about the roses at 10, and he said he was busy." "Was the door locked then, ma'am?" She blinked. No, of course not." "And since then?" "Alice brought in the post at 11:30, the housemaid ventured. Her hands twisted together, expressing a distress more sincere than many tears. "I knocked. He said he was not to be disturbed." "Thank you." Cotterell looked around the room. Windows latched, great cold, no sign of a struggle. He eyed the desk, the paper beneath Mr. Hargreaves' hand, and the small glass with a film at the bottom that might have been water and might have been anything. "Poor man," murmured Miss Marple, mostly to the doctor, who did not mind the old lady's murmurs. So determined to listen. One forgets how fatiguing silence can be. Dr. Wainwright gave her a dry look. "You have a poet's way of putting things, Miss Marple. He's been dead perhaps an hour. Less, if one is optimistic. We shall see what the coroner says, of course." When the inspector began gently but firmly shepherding the guests out of the study, the village, because a village is a living creature that needs air to breathe its stories, spilled onto the lawn. The afternoon had the offended look of a day pulled from its proper purpose. Tea stood cooling on the tables, plates of seed cake and cucumber sandwiches sat short of hands that could not quite remember how to be hungry, and conversation broke like surf, advancing, retreating, carrying rumour and shingle. Locked from the inside, Mrs. Pettigrew confided to the postmistress, who had come to help pack away the bunting and had stayed to witness tragedy. "I distinctly heard the inspector say it. And that glass. Frosted. You don't frost a door unless you mean to hide something. Lavinia never liked the look of fingerprints, I expect." The postmistress, Mrs. Bell, who had made a career out of not being surprised by envelopes, said, "When people die sudden-like in a locked room, it's either the Lord calling or someone clever helping him along." "You are wicked," Mrs. Pettigrew said, delighted. She leaned closer. "Between us, Mr. Hargreaves had dealings. You know he chaired the trust, the property for the new memorial hall, prices going up and down like yo-yos. People can be quite put out when their dreams are delayed." "People are put out when their cakes are delayed," Mrs. Bell replied. "Dreams are worse." Tom Beale, who had forced the door, stood with his cap in his hands and looked appalled by his own strength. His wife, the young Mrs. Beale whom Miss Marple had noticed earlier, kept glancing toward the house with an expression that might have been fear and might have been calculation. She was pretty in a fragile way, the kind of prettiness that trembles at the thought of tears and knows exactly the effect of trembling. "We should go," she whispered. "I said I'd see to Mother's medicine." "We're not to," Tom said, his eyes on the inspector. "Not yet." On the far side of the lawn, Miss Marple allowed her knitting to lie idle in her lap. The wool was soft as a secret. She watched the congregation of grief and curiosity sort itself into its customary groups, those who comforted, those who sought comfort, and those who made of the occasion a small pulpit from which to describe how, had they been consulted, events would have been quite otherwise. She had a small sympathy for all of them. Human nature, in her experience, always came in these tidy bundles, patterned like the rows of a well-knit scarf. "Miss Marple," Inspector Cotterell said, coming to stand with a conscientious awkwardness. He had once told Dr. Wainwright that the old lady had the unsettling habit of noticing the wrong thing at exactly the right time. "You were near the corridor when the scream was heard." "I was near the tea," Miss Marple said, as if that placed her precisely, "but I observe better with a teacup in hand than most do with a magnifying glass, Inspector. It settles the mind." Alice screamed. Mrs. Hargreaves went first. Everyone else came. Oh, and Mrs. Pettigrew dropped her glove in the rush. She does that when excited. It is a habit, not a clue. Cotterell's mouth twitched. "Any other habits to report?" "Only that Mr. Hargreaves disliked draughts," said Miss Marple, mild as milk. "There is a small rolled towel at the base of the study door. He must have tucked it there earlier. Such things suggest a person who prefers his air unmixed." Cotterell glanced back toward the house. "We'll need statements." He hesitated. "You knew the vicar wasn't coming today?" "Mrs. Hargreaves told me. Nerves, poor man." Miss Marple tilted her head. "It is odd, isn't it, for a clergyman to be nervous on a garden afternoon?" "Depends who's pouring the tea," the inspector said, and then looked faintly guilty. "I'll ask him a few questions if he's up to it." The gossip moved from the locked door to the nature of Mr. Hargreaves' position in the village. He had been a careful man with other people's money and a somewhat careless one with his own opinions. The trust had acquired a parcel of land on the edge of the common where old Mr. Cartwright's dairy had been. The sale had left Mr. Cartwright's daughter, a stern woman with a look like a closed ledger, feeling cheated of gravitas if not of funds. Then there were murmurs about the allotments, plots shifting, leases shortened for the good of the plan. People found themselves moved along like counters on a board, and their smiles had been as fixed as the pegs in a cribbage set. Miss Marple listened as the story drew itself, line by line, from a dozen mouths that did not believe in collaboration. She tucked away a fragment here. Alice burnt her hand on the range last week and had been clumsy since. A fragment there. Mrs. Pettigrew's inheritance was smaller than she let on, and she was forever meeting the solicitor. And another, young Mrs. Beale had been seen walking by the river with a man not her husband, though of course it might have been a cousin. None of these things was important, and yet, as she often reflected when darning stockings, the tiny snags mattered if one wished to avoid a hole. When the constabulary began to take statements, the party broke into a slow procession, names collected like posies. The afternoon light turned cooler, slipping behind thin cloud, and shadows lengthened across the lawn, as if the day itself were leaning to listen. Dr. Wainwright came out at last, closed his bag, and gave a brief shake of the head to Mrs. Hargreaves that said nothing new and everything necessary. "Come, my dear," Miss Marple murmured to the bereaved woman, offering her a seat on a bench under the pear tree. "One must sit to receive condolences, or they knock one over like waves." "I don't know how to bear it," Mrs. Hargreaves said, in the voice of someone who has never asked how to do such a thing and resents the need to learn. He had no enemies. "Oh," Miss Marple said gently, "no one has enemies, not in a village. We have acquaintances of long standing." Mrs. Hargreaves gave her a sharp look that might have been pique if it had been stronger. "You think someone—" "I think," Miss Marple said, folding her hands over the quiet wool, "that people are often as they are, whether alone in a locked room or out in the sunshine. The difference is only what we can see." At that moment, Bill, still eager to be useful, came running from the house. "Inspector," he called. "Sir, there's a letter, half written. It has Mrs. Hargreaves' name at the top." He halted, catching sight of the widow sitting very straight, and his voice tumbled into a whisper. "Beg pardon, ma'am." Cotterell took the boy's meaning and strode back into the house, the throng tilting after him like flowers toward a passing cloud. Miss Marple sat very still. The garden made its usual garden noises. A bee reconsidering a blossom, the tiny thud of an overripe pear giving up its hold. She did not follow. A half-written letter said quite enough by simply being unfinished. It told you a person had meant to go on. She turned her gaze toward the lane beyond the hedge where, if one were inclined, one might walk to the vicarage and ask a nervous man whether he had ever noticed a rolled towel beneath a door and what he thought of unmingled air. The next morning broke cool and pale, with a mist that lingered over the hedgerows and crept along the cobblestones of St. Hilary Mead. From her front parlour window, Miss Marple observed the street as she sipped her tea. Nothing extraordinary at first glance. Mrs. Pettigrew's cat patrolled the fence. The milkman rattled his bottles, and the postman trudged up the lane. Yet the calm was an illusion. The news of Mr. Hargreaves's death had moved through the village with the stealth and speed of ivy, twining around every conversation until it was the only thing left to talk about. Miss Marple had known that would be so. People in St. Hilary Mead were not unkind, merely curious by habit. They believed every mystery must be, in the end, a matter of knowing who had said what to whom and when. To them, murder was less a crime than an elaborate breach of etiquette. By 10 o'clock, the inspector's motor car was again outside the Laurels. A small crowd had already formed by the gate, villagers on their way to errands suddenly finding their feet reluctant to move on. Inside, the drawing room was heavy with the perfume of lilies someone had sent, as if flowers could disguise the scent of shock that clung to the air. Mrs. Hargreaves sat rigidly on the sofa, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. Dr. Wainwright stood by the hearth, speaking in low tones to Inspector Cotterell, who was flipping through the half-finished letter Bill had found. Miss Marple arrived without announcement, greeted by Alice the maid with a nervous bob. "The mistress said you were always to be admitted, ma'am. She's that grateful for your kindness yesterday." "I dare say she needs someone to talk sense to her," Miss Marple said gently, setting aside her hat and gloves, "and perhaps someone to pour the tea properly." The doctor gave a small nod of greeting. "I've confirmed what we suspected. Arsenic, most likely. Enough to stop a strong heart in minutes. It was in the water glass. Not much, but potent." Mrs. Hargreaves made a faint sound, half gasp, half sob. "But he hardly took anything yesterday morning. A biscuit at breakfast, tea at 11, then nothing until luncheon." "Tea at 11, repeated Miss Marple softly. "And that was brought to him, was it not?" "Yes, by Alice." All eyes turned toward the maid, who went pale as the tablecloth. "I swear, ma'am, I only did as I always do. Boiled water, the tin of leaves, a bit of sugar. He never liked much milk, you know." Miss Marple's tone was mild, almost comforting. "No one said you did anything, my dear. One simply asks so that one may understand." Cotterell cleared his throat. "There's also this." He lifted the letter carefully from its envelope. "It's addressed to you, Mrs. Hargreaves. Only a few lines, unfinished, as if he meant to continue." He began to read, his voice steady. "My dear Lavinia, there is something I must tell you before this business of the trust goes further. You will be angry, but it must be said, for your own sake if not mine. The truth about the purchase." Then the words broke off in a streak, the pen trailing as though seized mid-sentence. Mrs. Hargreaves stared at it, stricken. "I don't understand. He said nothing to me. We were happy enough, everyone knows." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, though no one had seen her take them out. "Everyone knows, yes. That's the trouble with happiness in a village, my dear. It's often something we perform rather than feel. Do you recall what time the post was delivered yesterday?" 11:30, Alice said faintly. "I took it in myself." "And you knocked, and Mr. Hargreaves told you not to disturb him." "Quite right." Miss Marple looked to the inspector. And yet the letter was begun after that, I'd wager. The ink was still wet when we found him, wasn't it? Cotterell frowned, flipping a page in his notebook. Yes, the doctor said so. Then someone must have seen him later than 11:30, Miss Marple said quietly, or entered unseen. The silence that followed was heavy. Mrs. Hargreaves clasped her hands together, the knuckles white. You can't mean, oh no, it's impossible. The door was locked. You saw it. Miss Marple's eyes softened. I saw it, yes, but one must never confuse what is locked with what appears to be locked. Cotterell gave a grunt that was half amusement, half irritation. You think he was murdered in some kind of trick, Miss Marple? A staged suicide? Not suicide, Inspector. Mr. Hargreaves was the sort of man who took his tea precisely at 11 and disliked the smell of tobacco. Such men do not take their own lives. They rely upon others to make things tidy for them. Outside, a car rumbled past, scattering the crowd that had gathered. Its noise seemed to release something in the room, and Dr. Wainwright gathered his bag with a sigh. I'll send the coroner's report this afternoon. Meanwhile, Inspector, I'd advise you to speak to Reverend Arkwright. The two men had words last week over the memorial funds, if gossip can be trusted, which in St. Hilary Mead, it can. When the doctor had gone, Mrs. Hargreaves rose with a sudden burst of agitation. It's all nonsense. Reverend Arkwright has been a friend for 20 years. If Henry spoke sharply, it was only over business. You mustn't let anyone drag his good name through the mud now he's gone. Miss Marple regarded her gently. No one wishes to do that, my dear, but truth is rarely so delicate as reputation. If one doesn't look closely, one never quite sees where kindness ends and self-interest begins. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took the short path through the churchyard to the vicarage. The ivy was thick on the stone walls, and the air smelled faintly of damp hymn books and lilac. Reverend Arkwright opened the door himself, his face pale and lined. Ah, Miss Marple, I suppose you've come about poor Henry. Dreadful business, dreadful. His hands fidgeted with the corner of his cassock. I had hoped to call upon Mrs. Hargreaves, but, well, the police and all that. Miss Marple stepped lightly into the hall. I thought you might prefer I came here. One doesn't like to speak of unpleasantness in a widow's house. He gave a grateful nod, ushering her toward his study, which was lined with old theological volumes and smelled faintly of pipe smoke and polish. Do sit down. I assure you I'm as shocked as anyone. A good man, Henry. Obstinate, perhaps, but sound. So I've heard, Miss Marple said mildly. And yet you were not at the garden party. You'd promised Mrs. Hargreaves you would attend. He hesitated. Ah, yes. I did write to her. I wasn't quite myself. A touch of fever, perhaps. You know how it is. Quite, said Miss Marple, though one wonders what sort of fever compels a man to remain indoors on such a fine day. Tell me, Reverend, did you write that note yourself? The question caught him off guard. Of course. Who else? Indeed, said Miss Marple, her tone pleasant. It was simply that your handwriting seemed firmer on your sermon drafts last week. But then, nerves can do strange things. He blinked rapidly. You've been looking at my sermons. One hears them, my dear, she replied with a faint smile. And memory, you know, is a curious companion. She rose and wandered to the window. From there she could see the narrow lane that led toward the laurels. You had business with Mr. Hargreaves, didn't you? Something about the trust? The Reverend sighed heavily. He wanted to sell off the remaining parcel of the church field. I told him it was consecrated ground, but he said the papers proved otherwise. We quarreled, yes, but I'd no reason to wish him harm. No, said Miss Marple softly. But perhaps someone else thought you did. He turned sharply. What do you mean? Miss Marple looked at him, eyes bright but kind. Oh, nothing so dreadful. Only that human beings are most inventive when they wish to appear innocent. If one wished to poison a man, for instance, and wished also to make it seem no one could have done so, well, one might contrive it rather cleverly. A locked door, a towel against the draught, a frosted pane so no one could see what was really happening. Reverend Arkwright swallowed. "You think the room wasn't truly locked?" "I think," Miss Marple said, reaching for her gloves, "that the answer lies in something very ordinary, a habit so simple everyone overlooked it. And perhaps, before long, we shall see who was counting upon that oversight." She left the vicarage as the church bell tolled for the evening hour, its notes soft and mournful over the misty green. The sound followed her up the lane, mingling with the rustle of leaves. In her mind, she could almost see the frosted door again, the shadow of a hand against the glass, and something else, something she had noticed but not yet put into words. As she turned into her gate, Miss Marple smiled faintly. The smallest things, she reflected, were always the most revealing. And in St. Hilary Mead, where everyone knew everyone, it was impossible to hide for long behind a pane of frosted glass. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the vicarage long after she had returned home. That faint tremor in Reverend Arkwright's voice. Was it grief or guilt? She could not yet tell. But one thing was certain. Something had been very deliberately arranged in Mr. Hargreaves's study, and the good Reverend's convenient illness might not be the coincidence it appeared. She sat by her hearth, the firelight soft upon her knitting, and listened to the quiet creak of the house settling. Patterns, she reflected, were not confined to yarn. Human nature wove its own, with knots of vanity and loops of fear. And somewhere in the intricate web of St. Hilary Mead, one thread had been tugged too tightly, snapping with fatal consequence. By the following morning, the village had transformed into a nest of speculation. The butcher's boy claimed he'd seen a stranger on the road the day before. Mrs. Pettigrew insisted it was arsenic in the biscuits, not the tea. And Mrs. Bell at the post office had taken to speaking in mournful whispers, as though every letter might now contain a confession. Miss Marple listened to it all without comment, filing each claim into its proper compartment. Gossip, she knew, was like chaff. It blew everywhere, but sometimes a seed hid within. At 11, Inspector Cotterill called upon her. He looked a little less certain of himself than usual, as though the case had begun to resist tidy explanation. "We've gone over the study from top to bottom," he announced as she showed him into her sitting room. No fingerprints but his own, no sign of tampering at the lock. The window latch was secure. If the poison was administered through the tea, it must have been before it reached him. "And Alice insists she did nothing unusual," Miss Marple said. "She does. We've examined the kitchen, the tea caddies clean, the water jug ordinary, the sugar untouched. And yet," he spread his hands helplessly, "arsenic doesn't appear out of thin air." Miss Marple poured him tea, her movements unhurried. "No, indeed. But it does appear where people least expect to find it. You see, Inspector, I once knew a lady who kept a bottle of weed killer under her sink. Rather a foolish place, as her husband discovered when he mistook it for cough syrup." Cotterill gave a faint groan. "You think this was an accident?" "Oh, no," she said gently. "I think it was made to look like one, or rather, made to look impossible, an effect some people find more convincing than simplicity. Tell me, Inspector, did you notice the fire grate?" "The grate?" He frowned. "Cold, you said yourself. No fire that day." "Precisely. And yet the ashes were disturbed, a little heap in one corner as though something small had been burned hurriedly. The doctor didn't mention it." "He said nothing of the sort." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Men seldom do when their attention is drawn to more obvious corpses. Cotterill leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "You think there was something burned? What, a letter?" "Perhaps. But if so, not one of his. Mr. Hargreaves was far too methodical to destroy evidence before finishing his sentence. No, I believe someone entered the room after he was dead, destroyed what they brought with them, and contrived to make the door seem locked. It's not so difficult, really, if one understands the way of latches." He blinked. "A trick lock. A simple string through the keyhole might suffice. Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. Or perhaps something more domestic. I imagine the towel at the base of the door served another purpose besides drafts. One could conceal any number of small devices under a cloth if one wished to pull it free after closing the door. Cotterell's brow furrowed. And who would go to all that trouble? Someone who wished the death to look private, inevitable. Someone close enough to know his habits. Someone who might even have been thought trustworthy. The inspector rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Mrs. Hargreaves, you mean? Miss Marple did not answer directly. She is overwrought, poor soul, but I did think her grief was of the sort that fears more for reputation than loneliness. No, I don't yet know who, but perhaps we might learn something from what was burned. Cotterell left soon after, promising to have the grate sifted for remnants. When the door closed behind him, Miss Marple sat very still. Her tea had gone cold. The image of the frosted glass door drifted again through her mind. The outline of the hand, yes, but also the faint misting at the lower edge, as though warm air had escaped beneath before the body cooled. She rose and fetched her shawl. There was someone she needed to see before the day was out. Tom Beale was in his garden when she arrived at the modest cottage behind the smithy. He looked uncomfortable to see her, but took off his cap respectfully. "Morning, Miss Marple. Don't suppose you've come about the begonias?" "No, Tom," she said kindly. "I've come about doors." His brow crinkled. "Doors?" "Yes, the one you helped open at the Laurels. I wonder, did you notice anything peculiar about the key when you forced it? The way it turned, perhaps?" He rubbed the back of his neck, thinking. "Funny you should ask. It weren't turned proper, like. More as if it had been half caught, snapped clean when I shoved the latch. I told the inspector that, but he said it didn't matter none." "Oh, but it does," said Miss Marple softly. "It matters very much indeed. Tell me, Tom, has your wife been keeping well?" He looked startled. "Meg? Well enough, I suppose. Been quiet since all this business. Can't abide the talk. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the flower beds, where rows of tulips stood like disciplined soldiers. "She looked pale yesterday. Shock, no doubt. Though I fancy shock sits easier when one is used to fear." The man's face hardened. "You're saying she's frightened of me?" "Oh no, my dear, not of you. Only of what she's seen. It's a heavy burden, knowing more than one should. But tell me, your wife used to do mending for Mrs. Hargreaves, didn't she?" He nodded warily. "Aye, bits and pieces. Why?" "Then she'd have known her way about the house, perhaps even the keys." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost musing. "One can copy a simple household key easily enough if one has the use of it for an hour. And if a lady happened to notice that her mistress kept certain papers locked away, well, temptation comes in small shapes." Tom's jaw tightened. "Meg wouldn't steal." "I didn't say she would," Miss Marple replied. "But perhaps someone persuaded her, someone who said it was only borrowing or protecting her mistress. Women in service are loyal creatures, but they can be used most cruelly." He said nothing more, only stared at the ground until Miss Marple excused herself. As she walked back through the lane, she reflected that guilt came in many guises. Silence was one of the easiest to wear. By evening the mist had returned, curling through the hedges like memory. The church bell tolled 6, and Miss Marple, seated once more in her parlour, heard hurried footsteps on the gravel outside. A knock followed, brisk but uncertain. Inspector Cotterell entered, his face alight with triumph and confusion in equal measure. "We found something, Miss Marple. Bits of burnt paper in the grate, just as you said. The writing's near gone, but there's a word that looks like trusteeship, and another name, Arkwright. Seems you were right about that quarrel." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "Did I not tell you human beings are very unoriginal in their secrets? One might almost pity them for repeating the same follies generation after generation." "Then it was the vicar?" Cotterell asked eagerly. "Perhaps," she said, smiling faintly. "Or perhaps not. But whoever did this wished to cast a shadow over a man already nervous. We must be careful not to mistake the direction of the light. Cotterell stared at her, half frustrated, half admiring. "You're never plain with me, are you, Miss Marple?" "Plainness," she said, "is rarely trusted, Inspector. Mystery, on the other hand, is the only language some people believe in." When he left, she sat long into the night, her needles clicking softly. Somewhere in the stillness, a pattern was forming, one stitch looping neatly into another. The trick of the lock, the towel under the door, the unfinished letter, all threads in a tapestry that, once turned the right way, would show a very different picture indeed. And as the clock chimed 9, Miss Marple smiled to herself, certain of one thing: the frost on that glass door had hidden not only death, but deception, and she meant to see both melted away. The following morning dawned with a brittle brightness, the sort that made the rooftops gleam and the hedgerows sparkle, but did nothing to lift the heaviness that hung over St. Hilary Mead. It was as though the village itself were holding its breath, waiting to see which way suspicion would turn. In the small grocer's shop, people spoke in lowered tones, their words half whisper, half speculation. By noon, it was accepted as near fact that the Reverend Arkwright had quarrelled violently with Mr. Hargreaves over the trust lands, and that he had been nervous ever since. Miss Marple, walking slowly past with her shopping basket, heard Mrs. Pettigrew declaring to anyone who would listen that men of the cloth were not what they used to be. Miss Marple, who knew that people's consciences often wore very respectable collars, said nothing. But she did glance toward the vicarage, where the curtains were drawn against the light. Her mind was busy with the details that never made it into gossip. The towel, the half-burned paper, and the unfinished letter. They fit together somehow, though not yet neatly enough to reveal their pattern. When she returned home, she found Inspector Cotterell waiting on her garden path, a folded paper in his hand, and the look of a man dissatisfied by progress. "I've been to the vicarage," he said as soon as she reached him. "Questioned Arkwright again. He swears he hadn't seen Hargreaves since last Thursday, but I'm not so sure." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "People often aren't sure when they wish they were." Cotterell followed her inside, accepting her offer of tea more for form than refreshment. "You were right about one thing. The burnt paper mentions trusteeship, yes, but there's another bit we've managed to piece together. Payment received. That doesn't sound much like church business." "No," she murmured, "though business cloaked in virtue is often the most profitable kind." She poured his tea and watched the steam curl upward, pale against the morning light. "And Mrs. Hargreaves, how is she bearing up?" "She's holding court," Cotterell said dryly. "Half the village has been in and out, bringing flowers and questions. But she's told me something new. Apparently her husband had been upset about a certain visitor last week, a man who came to the door asking for him by name. She didn't see the face, only heard the voice. Said it was rough, not local." Miss Marple stirred her cup, her eyes thoughtful. "And did this stranger call again?" "Not that anyone said, but it's curious, if there was a stranger at all. I've no reason to think he existed except her word." "Her word may be true," Miss Marple said gently, "but truth can be like a tapestry, accurate in design, misleading in perspective." The inspector looked at her helplessly. "Sometimes, Miss Marple, I think you'd have made a devil of a detective." "Oh, no," she said with a smile. "I've simply made a long study of people who wish they were better than they are." That afternoon, she took a quiet stroll to the Laurels once more. Alice let her in with a face still blotched, from tears, though there was a flicker of relief in seeing the familiar figure. Mrs. Hargreaves was in the drawing-room again, seated precisely where she had been before, the faint scent of lilies still hanging in the air. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, settling beside her, "the inspector tells me you had a visitor last week." "A stranger?" Mrs. Hargreaves nodded, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. It was the Thursday before the party. I was in the garden. He came up the path. Rough-looking man, coat collar turned up. Asked for Henry, said it was about the land, whatever that meant. I told him my husband wasn't home and he left. I didn't think anything of it. Did you mention it to your husband? Yes. He said it was nonsense, some mistake, and that I wasn't to open the door to anyone I didn't know. He seemed angry, more than usual. Angry. She hesitated. Yes. Lately he'd been strange, distracted, almost as if he were afraid of something, though he'd never admit it. And then the letter. Her voice broke and she looked away. Do you suppose he meant to tell me about that quarrel with the Reverend? Perhaps he regretted it at last. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. Perhaps he did. But I rather think the letter wasn't about the quarrel at all. If it were, he could have finished it without trouble. No, there was something else. Something too dangerous to write plainly. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then Miss Marple said, My dear, have you noticed anything missing since your husband's death? Papers, perhaps? Keys? Mrs. Hargreaves frowned slightly. Now that you mention it. Yes, his small notebook, the one he carried everywhere. It's gone. I thought perhaps the police had taken it. They haven't, Miss Marple said softly. And that notebook would have contained all his dealings, no doubt. Every payment, every name. She rose, smoothing her skirt. You've been very brave, Mrs. Hargreaves. Try to rest. I believe this will all come to light very soon. As she stepped into the hall, she paused to glance at the frosted door of the study. The police had sealed it, but she could still see the faint outline of a handprint on the glass. The one they'd thought was Mr. Hargreaves's. She looked closer. The shape was delicate, the fingers slender. Not a man's hand at all. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply smiled a little, as though she had been reminded of something amusing and private, and walked out into the crisp air. By evening the news had spread. The Reverend Arkwright had collapsed during evensong. Some said it was guilt, others that he'd taken ill from the strain. Miss Marple, hearing the church bell ring hurriedly for the doctor, took up her shawl and made her way down the lane. The vicarage door was open when she arrived. Inside, the Reverend lay on the sofa, pale but conscious, Dr. Wainwright bending over him. Exhaustion, the doctor muttered, straightening as she entered. A man can only bear so much talk of sin before his nerves rebel. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the vicar's trembling hands. And yet, doctor, sometimes nerves are the most honest thing about us. They tell what our lips refuse to say. Reverend Arkwright managed a weak smile. You think I'm hiding something, Miss Marple? Oh, not hiding, she said kindly. Merely postponing the inevitable. Tell me, you wouldn't happen to know what became of Mr. Hargreaves's notebook? He blinked. Notebook? No, of course not. She smiled faintly. How odd. Because I rather think you burned part of it, didn't you? You see, the paper in his grate had your handwriting on the edge. Just the curl of an A, but distinctive nonetheless. A man of sermons leaves a signature in every flourish. Arkwright's face drained of color. I can't prove it, no, she said mildly. But I can understand it. A clergyman might find himself entangled in financial mischief, might fear exposure. He might think to destroy the evidence, but find the man dead already. So he does what he can, burns what's dangerous, locks the door, and prays that God will forgive both his sin and his cowardice. He stared at her, breathing unevenly. You think I killed him? No, she said gently. But someone used your fear very cleverly. Someone who knew you'd make an excellent scapegoat. The Reverend buried his face in his hands. Then who? Miss Marple sighed. I don't yet know, but I do know this. The killer was not clever enough to notice that frosted glass distorts more than sight. It preserves shadows, and somewhere in that shadow is the truth. She left him with the doctor, her steps slow along the path. The village lamps flickered to life, one by one, casting soft halos in the gathering dusk. Miss Marple paused beneath the last one, her breath a pale mist in the cold air. The pieces were nearly in place now. A copied key, a missing notebook, a handprint too fine for a man, and a towel that had hidden more than a trick of the lock. It was almost complete. All that remained was to tug the final thread and watch the whole deceit unravel. The next day dawned cold and brittle, as if the world itself had grown cautious. The news of the Reverend's collapse had deepened the mystery, adding another thread to the tangle of speculation that bound St. Hilary Mead in quiet panic. People still spoke softly at doorways and over hedges, yet beneath their words was a new unease, the sense that the crime was not simply tragic, but close, almost intimate, as though the village itself were somehow complicit. Miss Marple walked to the post office after breakfast, ostensibly to buy stamps. Mrs. Bell, who managed both gossip and postage with equal efficiency, was already whispering behind the counter to Mrs. Pettigrew. They broke off as Miss Marple entered, but not before she caught the tail end of Mrs. Pettigrew's remark. And if it was her handprint, well, that explains why she's been shut up in that house, doesn't it? "Good morning, ladies," Miss Marple said pleasantly, pretending not to have heard. "A lovely morning, isn't it? The sort that makes one forget there's ever been unhappiness in the world." Mrs. Bell gave her a look full of curiosity and invitation. "You'd know best, Miss Marple, you being so observant. They say the Reverend's taking quite a turn. Nervous collapse, they call it." "Quite understandable," said Miss Marple, selecting her stamps. "It's a heavy thing to bear, being suspected of wickedness when one's only fault is fear." Mrs. Pettigrew gave a sharp little sniff. "I dare say fear's convenient when one has reason to tremble." "Indeed it is," Miss Marple replied mildly, "and most convenient of all when one wishes others to tremble in one's place." That silenced them both effectively. Miss Marple paid for her stamps, tucked them neatly away, and left with a small smile. Words in a village were like wind in a chimney, sometimes a nuisance, but always revealing where the drafts came from. On her way home, she took the longer path that curved past the allotments. There she saw Meg Beale bent over a bed of cabbages, her hands red from cold earth. The young woman started slightly when she noticed Miss Marple, then straightened and wiped her hands on her apron. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said with forced brightness. "Good morning, my dear. A fine day for planting." Meg gave a small laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It keeps my hands busy. Tom says I think too much when I've nothing to do." "Thinking can be rather dangerous," Miss Marple said softly, "especially when one knows something worth thinking about." Meg froze, the color draining from her face. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," said Miss Marple, her tone still gentle. "You see, I've been wondering who it was Mr. Hargreaves trusted enough to hand his post to when Alice was occupied. Someone he saw often, someone who could come and go without comment. You did some mending for Mrs. Hargreaves, didn't you? Perhaps you delivered things to the study?" Meg's hands trembled as she bent again to the soil. "Sometimes. Maybe. But that don't mean anything." "Of course not. Only—" Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "You see, there's the matter of the towel. Such an odd little thing to notice, yet so telling. Someone placed it neatly against the door after he died, to make certain the draft wouldn't carry away the trick. That someone had small hands, and quick ones. I can't imagine Tom's great fingers could have managed such a delicate contrivance." Meg's breath caught audibly. "You think I did something?" "I think," Miss Marple said kindly, "that you know who did, and that you've been frightened into silence. My dear, guilt and fear both weigh heavily, but confession has a curious way of lifting one and halving the other." Tears spilled over Meg's cheeks before she could turn away. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple waited, her silence as patient as the growing day. "It was Mrs. Hargreaves," Meg whispered at last. "She told me to take a parcel to the study that morning. Said it was some documents for her husband to sign. I'd been helping her with errands. She was kind to me, always paid fair. I thought nothing of it. When I got there, he was on the telephone, angry as I'd ever heard anyone, talking about betrayal and payment. He waved me to leave it on the desk. I went out, but she was waiting in the hall. She took something from her bag, a small bottle, and told me not to speak of the visit. I thought it was medicine, Miss Marple. I truly did. And afterward, she told me to fetch the maid, said Mr. Hargreaves mustn't be disturbed. Later, when the scream came, oh, God forgive me, I knew. Miss Marple placed a steadying hand on her arm. You poor child, but you see how lies begin, don't you? A little loyalty, a little fear, and before one knows it, one's part of a terrible story. Meg nodded, sobbing quietly. I didn't tell the police because she said no one would believe me. And Tom, he needs his job at the trust. Quite so, Miss Marple murmured. But truth has a way of surviving threats, my dear. It is rather like a weed. Once it takes root, it will find the light no matter how carefully one covers it. That evening, Miss Marple sent a note to Inspector Cotterell, asking him to call at her cottage. He arrived at dusk, his boots muddy from the lane and his face drawn. "You've something for me?" "I have," she said, handing him a folded paper. "Meg Beale's statement. She's a frightened girl, but truthful enough when cornered. It seems Mrs. Hargreaves had both motive and opportunity." Cotterell read quickly, his expression hardening. If this is true, it's a damn cold business, poisoning her own husband to protect her dealings with the trust. "Not to protect them," said Miss Marple quietly. "To conceal them. Mr. Hargreaves must have discovered her secret. Perhaps that she had been diverting money through an intermediary. She feared exposure and disgrace. A respectable woman with her social standing. Such people will do anything to preserve appearances." Cotterell frowned. "And the lock? The towel?" "She staged it," Miss Marple explained, eyes distant as she pieced it together aloud. After he drank the poisoned tea, she entered the study again. When he collapsed, she burned the incriminating papers, then looped a fine thread through the key and out beneath the towel. She pulled it shut from outside, then removed the thread, leaving the door apparently sealed. The towel concealed the mechanism, and her handprint upon the glass was simply an oversight born of haste. Cotterell let out a low whistle. "You make it sound so simple." "It always is," she said with a sigh. "Murder, you see, is rarely clever. Only desperate." That night, under Miss Marple's quiet guidance, the inspector went to the Laurels. Mrs. Hargreaves was calm when they arrived, as though expecting them, but when Cotterell produced Meg Beale's written confession and the laboratory report confirming the arsenic residue on the parcel paper, her composure faltered. She denied it at first, softly and with pride, then more fiercely, insisting it had been an accident. But Miss Marple's calm, pitying gaze seemed to drain the last of her defiance. Her voice broke. "He was going to ruin me. Ruin everything. You can't understand, Miss Marple. My life would have been over." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost sorrowful. "My dear, it was over the moment you stopped trusting in the truth. Appearances never saved anyone, you know. They only delay the reckoning." When the police led her away, the village was still. A few lights flickered behind curtains, shadows moving like whispers across the panes. Miss Marple stood for a moment in the chill air, her shawl drawn close. There was no triumph in her, only a quiet understanding, the same she had felt many times before. Human weakness, she thought, was as predictable as the seasons. It flowered, it faded, and it always left behind a trace in the soil. As she walked home beneath the pale moonlight, the frost was forming once more on the windows of the Laurels. Behind the glass, the study door stood open at last, revealing nothing more than a quiet room, an empty chair, and the faint scent of extinguished lilies. For several days after Mrs. Hargreaves's arrest, the village of St. Hilary Mead existed in a peculiar hush, as though the air itself were thick with disbelief. Even those who prided themselves on expecting the worst of others found it difficult to accept that the elegant, gracious hostess of the Laurels, the woman who poured tea with such steady hands, had poisoned her husband. Yet the evidence, as Inspector Cotterell said with weary conviction, was uncomfortable in its completeness. The arsenic had been traced to a bottle in the garden shed, the bottle labelled neatly in Mrs. Hargreaves's handwriting. Meg Beale's statement, though given haltingly and through tears, had filled the gaps in the story like plaster between bricks. The case, to most minds, was settled. But not to Miss Marple. She sat in her parlour 3 mornings later, her knitting lying idle in her lap, and frowned into the fire. The simplicity of the conclusion troubled her. It was all too neat, too swift, too convenient. She had lived long enough to know that truth seldom presented itself in such tidy packages. Life had a way of leaving loose ends, and those loose ends, when pulled, often unraveled the whole design. She rose, wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, and went to the window. Outside, the lane was slick with the residue of last night's rain. The trees hung bare and heavy, their branches dripping. Across the road, young Bill from the Hargreaves household was making his way toward the shop, a letter clutched in his hand. She watched him for a moment, her eyes narrowing in thought. A letter. Letters again. Always letters. Within the hour, she was at the post office, pretending to be interested in the new halfpenny stamps, while Mrs. Bell sorted through a pile of outgoing correspondence. "Terrible business, that Hargreaves affair," Mrs. Bell remarked, not looking up. "Inspector says it'll go before the assizes come spring. Poor woman. They say she hardly speaks a word in her cell." "Remorse is often silent," Miss Marple said mildly, "and sometimes innocence too." Mrs. Bell's hands paused. "You think she's innocent?" "I think guilt is rather like mildew," Miss Marple replied. "If it's there, it spreads, and this case smells too clean for comfort." The postmistress gave her a startled look, but Miss Marple had already turned away, her mind elsewhere. That afternoon she went to see Dr. Wainwright. The doctor, a precise man with a fondness for the factual, greeted her with a puzzled frown. "You've been thinking again, Miss Marple. I can always tell when you have that look." "Thinking, yes," she admitted, "and I'm afraid my thoughts are troublesome." "Tell me, doctor, was the poison definitely taken through the tea?" "Without doubt," he said. "The residue in the cup, the timing of the symptoms, all point to that." "And yet," she said softly, "Mr. Hargreaves was not the only one who drank tea that morning, was he?" He blinked. "I suppose not. But no one else was affected." "Ah, but that's just the thing," she murmured. "Suppose the tea wasn't the source after all. Suppose it was something added later, or even before the pot was made." Dr. Wainwright frowned, rubbing his chin. "The maid swore she prepared it as usual." "She did. But she mentioned fetching sugar from the pantry, didn't she, and leaving the tray unattended in the hall for a moment?" The doctor hesitated. "So she did. You think someone interfered?" "I think someone wanted us to believe Mrs. Hargreaves had the opportunity," Miss Marple said quietly. "And that person was clever enough to use her own fear as a weapon. Fear can make a woman act foolishly, burn papers, hide evidence, until she looks guilty even when she's not." Dr. Wainwright's eyes widened. "Then who?" "I don't know yet," she said, standing. "But I mean to find out. There's one piece still missing, the notebook. If we find that, I believe everything else will fall neatly into place." Later that evening, when the mist had begun to roll across the green, Miss Marple walked to the Laurels. The house stood dark, its shutters closed, a pale ghost of its former grace. A single constable kept watch at the gate, and she offered him a smile so warm and grandmotherly that he barely hesitated before letting her through. Inside, the room smelled faintly of polish and decay. In the study, the air was colder still. The frosted door had been repaired, but Miss Marple's eyes went at once to the writing desk. The papers had been cleared, the drawers emptied for evidence. But one thing remained, a thin sliver of paper trapped beneath the blotter. She eased it free. It was torn almost beyond recognition, but a few words stood out. Transfer, account, Cartwright land. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Cartwright. The name pricked at her memory. The daughter, stern and silent, who had lost her father's dairy land to the trust purchase. A woman whose face held bitterness like an engraving. Mrs. Cartwright had spoken little at the garden party, but Miss Marple remembered her gaze, fixed, cold, unwavering on Mrs. Hargreaves' husband. She took the scrap with her when she left and went straight to the inspector's office. Cotterell looked up in surprise as she entered. Good heavens, Miss Marple, have you been breaking into crime scenes again? I merely borrowed what others had overlooked, she said, laying the fragment before him. Tell me, Inspector, have you considered Mrs. Cartwright? The old dairy woman. She's a sour one, but hardly capable of— Oh, my dear man, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Bitterness can be as lethal as poison if it's left to steep long enough. Mr. Hargreaves took her family's land for the trust, land her father swore was theirs for generations. And who, do you suppose, provided the arsenic in the garden shed? It was labeled weed killer, yes, but Mrs. Cartwright sells the very same mixture to the village. She would know its strength, and she could have come to the laurels easily enough. She was once Mrs. Hargreaves' housekeeper before they quarreled. Cotterell sat back, frowning. You think she did it and let the wife take the blame? Precisely. A revenge both cruel and practical. She could not reach Mr. Hargreaves' conscience while he lived, so she struck at his legacy by destroying his good name and his wife's. But she misjudged one thing, Mrs. Hargreaves' vanity. A woman like that will confess to anything before she allows her secrets to be pried open. It made her the perfect scapegoat. Cotterell stared at her. If you're right, you'll find the missing notebook hidden near the Cartwright property, she said calmly. Probably buried or burned halfway. She would not have destroyed it entirely. It was too precious, too validating. She would keep a fragment to gloat over. Before midnight, Cotterell sent men to search the old dairy grounds. They found what Miss Marple had predicted, a leather-bound notebook, scorched but legible in parts, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the stable. It contained entries showing that Mrs. Hargreaves had paid restitution, quietly and repeatedly, to Mrs. Cartwright for the land dispute. Payments that would have ruined her reputation if exposed. And at the back, a final page, written in Mr. Hargreaves' hand, naming Mrs. Cartwright as the instigator of forged deeds. When the inspector returned with the news, Miss Marple merely nodded, her face serene. You see, Inspector, she said softly, villainy rarely begins in passion. It begins in injury and ends in pride. Mrs. Cartwright was arrested the next morning. She confessed with weary defiance, saying only that justice was done one way or another. The papers called it the poisoned trust case. London correspondents came down by train to photograph the village green. For weeks, St. Hilary Mead lived in the echo of its own notoriety. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her garden, tending her roses with the same quiet diligence as before. When Cotterell stopped by to thank her, she only smiled and said, Oh, I did very little, Inspector. It was all quite human, really. One must simply know what people are capable of when they feel wronged. And as she turned a rosebud in her hand, the frost that clung to it glittered faintly in the morning sun, like a door no longer hiding anything at all. In the weeks that followed, the scandal of St. Hilary Mead rippled outward, its quiet lanes carrying whispers like fallen leaves swept along a current. The villagers spoke of little else, Yet as time passed, the talk grew cautious, for the story had begun to take on the air of legend rather than fact, a cautionary tale told between the bread counter and the church pew. Mrs. Cartwright's confession had satisfied the law, but to those who had lived among her it was an unspeakable astonishment. A woman wronged, yes, but to have plotted so carefully, to have let another take the fall, well, it made people uncomfortable, as though a mirror had been held up to their own secret grudges. Miss Marple listened without comment. She knew that human nature, once confronted with wickedness, rarely lingered on understanding. It turned instead toward distance, pretending that evil came from somewhere else, from other sorts of people. But she herself was not quite satisfied, for although the case was closed, there remained a small uncertainty, a thread that refused to tuck itself away neatly. It was not that she doubted the guilt of Mrs. Cartwright. No, the woman's bitterness had been plain enough. But something about the details still itched at her mind, like a stitch pulled slightly tight in the knitting. One afternoon, as she pruned the early roses, Inspector Cotterell appeared at her gate. He looked lighter than she had ever seen him, as though the weight of the case had finally lifted. "Good news, Miss Marple," he announced. "They've found the rest of Hargreaves's papers in the cottage loft. Seems Mrs. Cartwright kept them all these years. Signed deeds, letters, even a few receipts tying her to the forged transactions. It settles everything quite nicely." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm glad," she said. "Though it's curious, isn't it, that she should keep what condemned her? Vanity, perhaps, or conscience." "Both, likely," Cotterell replied, rubbing his hands together. "She'll stand trial next month. Should be straightforward enough. I dare say you can rest easy now." "Rest?" Her eyes twinkled. "My dear Inspector, rest is only for those who dislike thinking. I've simply been wondering how Mrs. Cartwright got into the study at the Laurels without being seen. The police said the servant's entrance was locked and the front watched, yet she must have come in at just the right moment." Cotterell shrugged. "Perhaps she went early, before the maid noticed. Or maybe the maid's memory isn't as sound as she claims." "Memory," Miss Marple murmured, "is a very selective servant. It tidies the drawing room and leaves the cupboard in disarray. Still, I think you're right in part. Someone's recollection isn't quite true." That evening she sat by her fire, the lamplight flickering across her thoughtful face. She took out her notebook, a habit of her own, though its entries were mostly domestic, and reviewed the timeline she had kept from the first day of the tragedy. Alice had taken in the post at 11:30. Mr. Hargreaves had been heard on the telephone shortly after. Then, by 12, he was dead. If Mrs. Cartwright had visited, it must have been in that narrow span. Yet how? Unless, of course, someone had helped her. Someone inside the house. Her eyes lifted slowly from the page. Alice. She had always pitied the girl, the trembling hands, the nervous speech, but pity, Miss Marple knew, could be the most deceptive of emotions. It blinded one to sharp edges. Had Alice perhaps been persuaded to deliver something to the study that morning? A parcel, a letter, something harmless in appearance, deadly in purpose. And when the deed was done, when panic set in, Mrs. Hargreaves had taken the blame upon herself rather than betray a servant she trusted. That, Miss Marple thought, would explain the woman's desperate silence, her refusal to defend herself even when condemned. A final act of vanity, yes, but also of misplaced loyalty. She rose abruptly, reaching for her shawl. The evening was dim and still when she knocked on the door of the small cottage behind the grocer's. Alice answered, startled to see her. "Miss Marple, Oh, do come in, if you please." The room was neat but airless, a single lamp casting long shadows. Miss Marple took the offered chair and studied the girl's face. "You've been very brave, my dear," she said kindly. "Few could have borne such a dreadful business so close." Alice twisted her apron. "I only wish it were over, ma'am. The talk never stops. Yes, but perhaps it will soon. You see, I've been thinking about that morning. You told the inspector you brought in the post and knocked, and Mr. Hargreaves told you not to disturb him. Yes, ma'am. And you didn't enter the room? Alice hesitated. No, ma'am. Only, well, the door wasn't quite closed. He looked cross, so I left the letters on the tray outside. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle. I see. And was anyone else about? Mrs. Hargreaves, perhaps? I didn't see her. A pause, then a faint quiver in her voice. But there was a knock at the kitchen door earlier. I thought it might be the butcher's boy. It wasn't. Was it Mrs. Cartwright? Alice's hands trembled. I don't rightly know. She wore a veil and her voice was rough. Said she'd something for the mistress, and I was to give it straight to Mr. Hargreaves. A small tin, all wrapped up. I didn't think, oh, Miss Marple, I didn't think. The old lady reached out and took her shaking hands. My dear child, very few people do. That is the tragedy of good intentions. They so easily become accomplices. Tears ran silently down Alice's cheeks. I wanted to tell someone, but after they said Mrs. Cartwright confessed, well, I thought it didn't matter. I never opened the tin, I swear it. I believe you, Miss Marple said softly. But you must tell the inspector everything. It matters greatly. The confession only told part of the story. Mrs. Cartwright may have planned the thing, but she needed someone inside to place her little gift where it would do the most harm. Your silence has protected her, you see, not yourself. The girl looked stricken. I'll tell him, ma'am, I promise. When Miss Marple left, the night had deepened, and the air was cool against her cheeks. She walked slowly home, the weight of pity heavy on her heart. Alice's part had been unwitting, yet it had sealed 3 fates: Mr. Hargreaves's death, Mrs. Hargreaves's disgrace, and Mrs. Cartwright's ruin. The inspector would see that the record was set right, but there was no triumph in that. Truth, she thought, was not a thing of satisfaction. It was simply the last duty owed to the living and the dead alike. At home, she placed her notebook back on the shelf and looked out the window toward the laurels. The frost was settling once more, thin and pale across the gardens. It glittered faintly on the windows, softening the outlines of the house until it seemed almost peaceful. But Miss Marple, gazing at it, knew better. Peace in a village was rarely the absence of sin. It was merely its disguise, waiting for spring to thaw it back into sight. The next morning brought a weak winter sunlight that lay across the cottages like a veil, too thin to warm anything beneath it. St. Hilary Mead had returned, at least on the surface, to its customary rhythm, children trudging to school with satchels, the milk cart rattling along the lane. But beneath the ordinary sounds there lingered a nervous hush, as though the village feared the echo of its own name in the newspapers. Miss Marple, who had been awake since dawn, poured herself a modest breakfast and allowed her thoughts to wander to Alice. She had gone straight to Inspector Cotterill after their conversation, as promised, and though the girl's confession had cleared Mrs. Hargreaves of deliberate murder, it had also raised uncomfortable questions about how easily innocence and guilt might change places under the right light. By mid-morning, Cotterill himself came to see her. He looked both relieved and disturbed, a combination Miss Marple had learned to associate with men who believed their work was done but could not quite feel proud of the result. "You were right again," he said as she ushered him into her parlor. "The maid's testimony fits perfectly. Mrs. Cartwright sent the tin, Alice delivered it, and Hargreaves drank from it. All tidy. The court will treat it as premeditated murder with indirect complicity." Miss Marple, who was arranging a plate of shortbread, gave him a faintly reproachful smile. "Oh, my dear Inspector, life is rarely tidy. Do you recall what Mrs. Cartwright said when she was taken away?" Cotterill frowned. "Something about justice being done. I took it for bitterness." "Bitterness, yes," Miss Marple said, "but also confidence. She spoke as a woman who knew she had accomplished exactly what she meant to, not as one who had merely stumbled into guilt." He sighed and leaned back. Then what more can there be? The poison was hers, the motive hers, the maid was merely a pawn. Perhaps, she murmured. Yet it troubles me that Mrs. Cartwright, who was neither impulsive nor reckless, should risk discovery by approaching the house herself. Why go to all that trouble, knowing the servants might recognize her voice? No, I think she had help beyond poor Alice. Someone who stood to gain from Mr. Hargreaves's death, not through hatred, but through opportunity. Cotterell gave a short laugh, half weary, half incredulous. You'll have me chasing ghosts before long. Ghosts, Miss Marple said gently, have the inconvenient habit of being real people no one noticed at the time. She poured his tea and let the matter rest, but her mind did not. That afternoon she walked to the Laurels again, where the constable on duty, an obliging young man with a fondness for her scones, let her through without protest. The house was silent, stripped of its former life. Dust sheets covered the furniture, and a faint, musty smell rose from the carpets. She stood in the study once more, letting her eyes drift over the familiar space. The heavy desk, the window that caught the garden's bare reflection, the frosted glass that had concealed so much. Her gaze fell upon a framed photograph still hanging beside the mantel, Mr. and Mrs. Hargreaves at some civic ceremony, standing among several local dignitaries. The faces were stiff with propriety, but one among them drew her attention. A young man, thin-faced, slightly too proud of his posture. The caption beneath named him Arthur Beale, Secretary of the Trust Committee. Arthur Beale. The surname struck like a pin in her memory. Tom Beale's cousin, mentioned in passing more than once, but never seen at the garden gatherings. She remembered Tom speaking of him once, with an awkward fondness tinged by envy. A clever one, my cousin, he'd said. Good with figures, always a place behind some desk. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Clever with figures, indeed. She had seen that expression before, the look of a man who believed himself clever enough to hide behind other people's failings. That evening she sent a note to Inspector Cotterell suggesting he look into the Trust's recent accounts. The reply came swiftly, brought by hand. You're a miracle, Miss Marple. The records show irregular withdrawals, small ones at first, growing larger just before Hargreaves' death. All signed by Arthur Beale in his capacity as secretary. We're questioning him tonight. Miss Marple smiled faintly. So the curtain rises again, she murmured. The next day dawned grey and windless. She received word from Cotterell that Beale had confessed to embezzling trust funds, but denied any role in the murder. He claims Mrs. Cartwright approached him for the poison, the inspector told her, and he simply arranged for the parcels to pass through the accounts to conceal her purchase. Says he didn't know what she meant to do with it. Does he strike you as a man who does things out of kindness? Miss Marple asked. Cotterell hesitated. No, but greed, yes. Then I imagine he knew very well what would happen, she said. He merely thought to profit from it. Mrs. Cartwright's vengeance, Mrs. Hargreaves's ruin, and the Trust's collapse, all left him to pocket the remnants unnoticed. Cotterell nodded grimly. We'll press him harder. By the time dusk fell, the inspector was back at her door, his face pale and his coat flecked with rain. He's dead, he said without preamble. Arthur Beale. Found in his lodgings. Gas fire turned full on. Looks like suicide. Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment. Or silence made tidy again, she said softly. Cotterell rubbed a hand over his brow. The coroner will say suicide, of course. There's a note? Forgive me. It's all too much. But I tell you, Miss Marple, I've seen frightened men, and I've seen desperate ones. He was neither. He was smug, even in the cell this morning. She nodded slowly. Then someone feared what he might yet reveal. Someone who still had something to lose. The inspector frowned. But who's left? Mrs. Hargreaves is in recovery at her sister's house. The maid's under protection, and Mrs. Cartwright's awaiting trial. Who else could care now? Someone connected with the Trust still. Miss Marple said. The Reverend, perhaps. Remember, he was treasurer before Hargreaves took over. He might have been drawn into Beale's dealings, however unwillingly, and fear is a dreadful master for a man of faith. Cotterell looked uneasy. You can't mean Arkwright again, after all that. Oh, I mean no harm to him, Miss Marple said quietly. Only that guilt wears many shapes, and the most dangerous is borrowed. I should like to speak with him once more. The following morning she walked to the vicarage. The Reverend received her in his study, pale and gaunt, but outwardly composed. The air smelled faintly of gas despite the open window. "You've come about poor Beale," he said, his voice dull. "A dreadful business. I warned him to turn from his sins, but he laughed." Miss Marple studied him closely. "So you spoke with him recently?" "Yesterday afternoon. He came here unannounced. Said he meant to make amends. I told him repentance must come through truth, not money. He said truth was a luxury few could afford. And then he left." Her gaze drifted to his hands, clasped tightly together on the desk. "You've had much to bear, Reverend, but the Lord, I think, prefers truth even when it's inconvenient to his servants." For a moment he met her eyes, and in that moment Miss Marple saw it. The flicker of relief that comes when confession seems near, and the stubborn pride that keeps it unspoken. "I did what I could to set things right," he murmured. "Beale begged me to hide the papers. I destroyed them for the good of the parish, but I never meant anyone harm." "Of course not," she said softly. "Yet harm, like truth, rarely waits for permission." When she left, the church bell was tolling for evening prayers, each note deep and mournful. She paused at the gate, looking back at the vicarage with its ivy-clad walls and shuttered windows. The whole affair had begun with a frosted door and ended with another closed one. Yet behind each, she reflected, there had always been the same thing, a desperate human heart doing its best to conceal the cost of its own mistakes. As she turned homeward, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, small and soundless, drifting on to her shawl. They melted at once, leaving faint damp marks that glistened and vanished, like guilt, she thought, when finally exposed to the light. The snow fell steadily through the night, softening the outlines of the world until the village seemed caught between waking and dreaming. By morning, St. Hilary Mead lay under a pale hush. The air was sharp, and smoke rose straight from the chimneys without wind to scatter it. Miss Marple, who had slept little, sat at her window watching the quiet transformation. The Reverend's confession had been halting, uncertain, but it had contained the ring of truth, though perhaps not all of it. Truth, she knew, was like those snowflakes outside. It appeared pure as it fell, yet melted into something quite different upon closer touch. After breakfast, she took her habitual walk, her boots crunching softly over the frosted lane. The village was subdued, the usual morning bustle muted as though everyone had agreed to speak in whispers until spring returned. Outside the church, she paused. The bell had ceased its mournful tolling, and the heavy oak doors were ajar. Inside, the air was cold, but faintly perfumed by candle wax and pine. The Reverend knelt near the altar, head bowed, his thin frame outlined against the grey light filtering through the windows. She did not disturb him, but when he rose and turned, he saw her waiting in the nave and gave a faint, weary smile. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, his voice hoarse, "I suppose you've come to finish what you began." "I never finish anything, Reverend," she replied mildly. "I merely tidy away the loose threads so others may rest easy. You've been carrying one too many, I think." He looked down, his fingers tightening on his prayer book. "I told you the truth. I burned Beale's papers. Only that. They were a snare to the parish, a temptation for others to gossip. I meant to protect what little peace we had left." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "Yes, but one must ask, what peace, and for whom? You see, I've been thinking about your meeting with Mr. Hargreaves the week before he died. You quarreled, didn't you, over the church land? He winced. Yes. He accused me of mismanagement, of being part of Beale's frauds. I told him I knew nothing of them. It was partly true, at least at the time. At the time, she repeated softly. And afterward? He hesitated, then looked at her with sudden despair. I found out too late. Beale came to me, begging for help. He'd forged Hargreaves's signature on one of the transfer papers, said he only meant to borrow against it. I swore I would fix it quietly, pay it back through the church fund, and no one need ever know. But Hargreaves discovered it. He threatened to expose us both. I pleaded with him for a day's grace. That was Thursday. On Friday, he was dead. Miss Marple regarded him steadily, her expression one of infinite sadness. And you thought his death an act of divine mercy, perhaps? He bowed his head. No, I thought it my punishment, and when Mrs. Cartwright confessed, I let her bear it. I told myself it was Providence. She had cause after all, and I was tired. She laid a hand upon his arm, the gesture more motherly than reproachful. You've punished yourself enough, Reverend, but I fear others were not so weary. Someone hastened Beale's end, and not from pity. He knew too much. He might have spoken of you, or of Hargreaves, and someone preferred silence to repentance. He stared at her, stricken. Then it wasn't suicide. No. The gas tap was turned by another hand. You see, Reverend, guilt rarely keeps company for long. It always seeks to share the burden. Beale's death was meant to close the circle of blame, to seal the story neatly. Only it didn't account for the smallest, most inconvenient truth. He looked bewildered. What truth? Miss Marple's eyes softened. That people, even wicked ones, are never entirely consistent. Beale was vain. If he had truly meant to end his life, he would have left a more dramatic farewell than a few dull lines. He'd have written pages, explaining his cleverness. No, someone wrote those words for him, someone who feared that cleverness might yet betray them. The Reverend's face paled. You think Mrs. Cartwright arranged his death from prison? Oh, no, she said softly. It was someone with far more opportunity, and as it happens, far more to lose. Someone who'd already once concealed evidence for the good of the parish. You, Reverend? He flinched as though struck. I swear to you I didn't. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Not you exactly, but perhaps a misguided act of protection. Beale came to you again, didn't he? After the confession, before his death, you thought to persuade him to tell the truth. But when he refused, you left him alone in that room. Later, when you returned, the gas was already flowing. You could have stopped it. Yet you didn't. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy. Finally, he whispered, I thought it was too late. I thought he meant it. Perhaps he did, she said kindly. But you let the moment pass, and in doing so, allowed sin to do your work for you. That, I think, is what's truly tormented you. The Reverend sank into the nearest pew, his hands covering his face. I prayed for forgiveness, he murmured. And I dare say you've received it, she said. God is far kinder than men, but truth, Reverend, must live in the daylight, otherwise it festers. Later that day, Inspector Cotterell came to see her once more, his expression subdued. You were right, he admitted quietly. The Reverend's come forward. Says he didn't kill Beale, but didn't save him either. We'll call it manslaughter, though it was more neglect than malice. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles moving steadily. Poor man. There's a difference between guilt and weakness, but it takes great courage to see it. Cotterell sighed. This village will take years to recover. Oh, I doubt it, she said mildly. Villages heal as gardens do, slowly, unevenly, and often over the very soil that once concealed decay. New roots will grow where old ones rotted. It's the way of things. When he left, she sat alone in the fading light. The room, filled with the small, homely sounds of the clock and the crackle of the fire. She thought of all the faces that had crossed her path during the affair. Mrs. Hargreaves, so proud and fearful, Alice, trembling with remorse, Mrs. Cartwright, bitter and spent, and the Reverend, bowed beneath a burden too heavy for his narrow shoulders. Each had believed themselves justified, each deceived by the simple conviction that their own pain outweighed another's truth. The frost was gathering again outside, tracing delicate patterns upon her window pane. She rose and looked through it, her reflection mingling faintly with the white garden beyond. The door to the laurels was still closed, though the constable's post had long been removed. Somewhere she knew the house would be let again, perhaps to some cheerful couple unaware of the history lingering behind that frosted glass. Miss Marple smiled faintly, as if amused by the inevitability of it all. Human folly, she thought, was as enduring as the seasons. It returned unfailingly each year, dressed in new manners but rooted in the same soil. And just as surely, someone would always be there to see through the frost and glimpse what lay behind the door. The snow lingered for 3 more days before the thaw began, slow and reluctant, revealing once again the grey stone of the cottages and the crooked hedgerows lining the lanes. The rhythm of St. Hilary Mead began to mend itself in small ways. The bell tolled again at regular hours, the grocer's shelves filled, and the talk at the post office returned, as it always did, to trifles and weather. Yet there was still a quietness, a pause in conversation whenever anyone passed the vicarage or the gates of the Laurels. People spoke less about the murder now, and more about its moral, as though to distance themselves from its intimacy. Miss Marple moved among them with her usual calm, offering a gentle word here, a practical kindness there. Those who had known her longest noticed that she seemed, if possible, more reflective than before, her eyes lingering on people rather than things, as though she were taking the final measure of a story that had yet to be written down properly. It was on the 4th evening after the Reverend's confession that Inspector Cotterell called once more, his coat dripping from a steady drizzle. He looked tired but composed, the face of a man who had at last traced the last thread through a knot. "It's finished, Miss Marple," he said quietly when she'd settled him near the fire. "The Reverend's given a full statement, everything, even the moment he found Beale dying and hesitated. The jury will see the mercy in it, I think. They've released Mrs. Hargreaves. She's gone to stay with family near Bath. As for Mrs. Cartwright, she's refused counsel and says only that she's ready for judgment. Strange how they all seem relieved one way or another." Miss Marple looked into the flames. "Relief often follows. Truth, my dear Inspector. It is like the end of an illness. The pain may linger, but the fever has broken. Each of them, in their own fashion, has confessed to something they feared would never be spoken aloud." Cotterell nodded. "It's a remarkable thing, how they all tied themselves to the same man's death, each from a different angle. I don't mind saying I've never seen anything so tangled." "Tangled, yes," she said with a faint smile, "but entirely human. Mr. Hargreaves was a man who built his life upon control. He managed other people's fortunes, their reputations, even their forgiveness. It is a dangerous thing to stand so high upon the scaffolding of one's own virtue. Eventually, one nail gives way and the whole structure collapses. He merely chose the wrong people to underestimate." Cotterell gave a soft, rueful laugh. "I'll say this much. You've the mind of a magistrate and the patience of a saint. I'd have called it done weeks ago." "Oh, you'd have been quite right too," Miss Marple said pleasantly, setting aside her knitting. "It was only that the frost on the door kept troubling me. You see, that detail, the frosted glass, it wasn't just a matter of atmosphere. It was the story's reflection. Everyone could see shapes moving behind it, but no one could see clearly enough to tell one shadow from another. And when people cannot see, they begin to imagine. That's when truth begins to slip into myth." Cotterell considered this for a moment, then smiled, half to himself. "You know, I'll never look at a pane of frosted glass quite the same way again." When he left, the night was heavy with fog. the lamplight pooling faintly on the path. Miss Marple stood at her door for a while, listening to the slow retreat of his footsteps. She was not triumphant. She never was. The satisfaction she felt was quiet, almost sorrowful, as though she had simply restored order to something that had always longed for disorder. Later, as she prepared for bed, her eyes fell upon the small scrap of paper she had kept, the fragment of Hargreaves's note, the one that had set her on the right course. Transfer, account, Cartwright land. Such tiny, careless words, yet they had concealed the ruin of 3 lives. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her book of sermons, between On Temptation and On Charity. That Sunday, she attended service at the church. The Reverend's assistant, a young curate newly arrived, spoke gently of forgiveness and human frailty, of how even the righteous may stumble upon the stones they have placed in others' paths. The congregation listened with bowed heads, and Miss Marple, from her seat near the aisle, felt the faintest stirring of something like peace. When the hymn ended and the parishioners filed out, she lingered by the porch, exchanging quiet words with those who passed. Meg Beale approached shyly, her face still pale but no longer fearful. "You were right, Miss Marple," she said softly. "Telling the truth does make one lighter. It's as if I can breathe again." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind. "That's the thing about truth, my dear. It's dreadfully heavy when carried alone, but it weighs almost nothing once it's shared." She watched the girl go, then stepped out into the sunlight. The air smelled faintly of thawed earth and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the sound of the village clock drifted across the rooftops. Steady, familiar, reassuring. As she walked home along the lane, she paused at the gate of the Laurels. The frost had melted from its windows, leaving them clear and bright. Through the glass, she could see the faint reflection of the garden, bare, dormant, yet waiting patiently beneath the soil for spring's return. Miss Marple rested her gloved hand on the gate-post and smiled, not at the house, but at the world itself. People would go on being foolish, deceitful, kind and cruel in equal measure. They would love too much, trust too little, and make the same old mistakes dressed in new disguises. And somewhere, in every village and every home, there would always be a door behind which the truth waited quietly for someone to notice it. With that thought, she turned toward home, her steps unhurried, the faintest hum of a hymn escaping her lips. Behind her, the world of St. Hilary Mead settled back into its ordinary rhythm. Tea at 4, gossip at 6, and peace, however fragile, restored once more.